Oh, what the fuck is up, yo? It's your host, Sean. I hope you're well, cunts. Time to dive into another timeline episode right now. But, just up front, I just wanted to say, this beat's just so funky. I just want to, rap along with it in some sort of fucking impromptu way. But, more so, this is actually a warning for any of our Indigenous listeners, Torres Strait Islanders, etc. This has some sensitive themes that might offend some people in it. A lot of talk of cultures and sensitive shit like that. So just a warning, heads up. But now that that's out of the way, what? Fuck yeah, cunts. Alright, that's enough of that. We'll catch you around. Send us a message. Drop it in, say hi, all those things. Got some special shit coming out for the Patreon people, like some actual little physical goodies that you'll be able to spread on toast. What? What does that mean? I know, right? Mystery, intrigue. Alright. Later, yo.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
You're listening to Carousel Sniper Victim, a Dead Glass Design production, with your host, Sean Jeffrey.
Hello, my name is Kathleen Muslin. I'm a Yaru Mulgana woman who lives in Carnarvon. My connection to the islands that lie 50 kilometres off Carnarvon is through my great-grandmother, who was forcibly taken away from the Broome area, where she's originally from. She was taken to the islands like so many other Aboriginal people from all over the state under the guise of having venereal diseases and other STIs, where evidence has proven that a lot of them didn't have that at all. She was taken there and she died there, like many others, and is still resting on the islands. This history has not been spoken about. It's going to be 100 years on January the 9th, 2019, that the last people were taken off the islands. It's very important that our history gets spoken about from our perspective as Aboriginal people and the descendants from those people who were taken there, never to return to their homelands again. And it's important that we get support from yourselves and everybody else in this country to be able to acknowledge this history of ours and to move forward for ourselves and our next generations and understand the trauma that they went through and that the trauma that it's causing us today. This history needs to be acknowledged and recognised so our future generations can know the story and start healing.
In February of the year 1911, for the first time in Australia, newspapers published detailed reports about a strange series of medical facilities. Established on islands around the Australian coast, these facilities were places where Aboriginal people, said to have been diagnosed with venereal diseases, were incarcerated and treated. One article reported that at one location alone, 55 operations were conducted in rough, makeshift conditions. Several inmates were also subjected to unsuccessful experimentation with a quote, vaccine. Around the turn of the 20th century, syphilis in all its forms was considered to be a major problem in many parts of the world, including the north of Western Australia. Then, as now, the disease was strongly stigmatised and referred to as evil and a loathsome misery. Like most areas of Australia, the islands off its coast have a dark history of oppression and racial discrimination by the peoples that have come since. What took place during the Lock Hospital scheme, around the small coastal town of Carnarvon in Western Australia, is one of the darker tales of medical mistreatment from Australia's recent history. Approximately 900 kilometres, or 560 miles north of Perth, Western Australia, lies the small coastal town of Carnarvon, situated where the mouth of the Gascoyne River meets the Indian Ocean. The popular Shark Bay World Heritage Area lies to the south of the town, and the Ningaloo Reef and the popular tourist town of Exmouth, which is actually where I grew up, lie to the north. The Ngada people are the traditional owners of the region around Carnarvon. Before European settlement, the place was known as Kuinyuwadu, which means neck of water. In 1904, after the construction of additional tramway bridges connecting the town site to the port areas, Carnarvon's Mile Jetty was opened, making Carnarvon the boom port town of the whole area. Over the next 2 years, though, the Australian political climate changed. In 1905-1906, the Aborigines Act would come into effect throughout Western Australia. The Aborigines Act 1905 was, quote, an act to make provisions for the better protection and care of the Aboriginal inhabitants of Western Australia. It governed the lives of all Aboriginal people in Western Australia for the next 60 years. The Act created the position of Chief Protector of Aborigines, who became the legal guardian of every Aboriginal child to the age of 16 years, and permitted authorities to, quote, send and detain Aboriginal children in institutions and in service work, or for medical experimentation in the Lock Hospital scheme. Prior to the Colonial Secretary's instructions under the 1905 Act, the Chief Protector sent a memo to protectors of Aboriginal people, requesting a, quote, return of Aboriginal women and men who were thought to have syphilis or other forms of venereal disease, and to cost the transport of so-called fit subjects to the Lock hospitals. The Commissioner of Police sent similar instructions in a letter to all police stations, authorising the use of force to detain Aboriginal people. This system of police surveillance, capture and transport often involved long journeys, on foot and by boat, and often in chains. Just after the turn of the 20th century, the Western Australian government formulated the scheme in which Indigenous people, questionably diagnosed with syphilis and other venereal diseases, were collected from their homeland communities across Western Australia and taken to lock hospitals all around the country. They were taken in the name of a public health measure to limit the spread of disease from Indigenous people to the colonists. Which Aboriginal Australians were judged to be syphilitic and rounded up for this scheme was primarily determined by the European police, pastoralists and medical officers. Patients were then held on the islands, which effectively functioned as prison hospitals, until deemed cured by the European doctors or until death. Before the idea of using these islands for medical purposes, it had already been suggested as early as 1892 that Aboriginal people should just be moved en masse to the islands. Special expeditions were sent out to bring in Aborigines for examination at coastal ports prior to being sent to the islands for treatment.
The collection methods were neither humane nor scientific. A man, unqualified except by ruthless and daring, and helped by one or two kindred spirits, toured the countryside, raided native camps, and by brute force examined the natives. The diseased were seized upon, chained by the neck, marched through the bush in search of further syphilitics. The power to determine the fate of Aboriginal people, judged to be suffering from venereal disease, rested primarily with the police troops.
The involvement of police in the collection, transport and treatment of the subjects of the Lock Hospital scheme led to great distrust of medical inspection by the Indigenous population. Many just fled into the bush when inspections occurred, and this isn't surprising since any able to walk were just chained up in the same manner as criminals. Police were normally equipped to collect up to 15 prisoners, and it was common for them to walk their captives from place to place until this quota had been reached. In 1908 and 1911, two major collections took place. The reason for the high levels of activity in these two dates are thought to relate to the substantial funding given to the scheme in these 2 years. As much as £6,000 a year in 1908, which today would be about £700,000 or 1.3 million Australian dollars.
My name is Bob Dorre and Mulgana Ingida person. My story is, well, it's quite as long as on Kathleen's lines, yeah, but we didn't have any first-hand information like she has, but being close to the coast and inland as well, there's bound to be some of our people over there. Well, there will be some of our people still there as well. What we're doing is trying to, run the story and get acknowledgement of what happened to our people. And if we can get a lot of people involved, and which we have, we've got a good team. So you get the whole story out. So there's a lot of people that don't know the story. It's been sort of hidden for that many years. People can read the story. As I said, there's a lot of people who don't know the story, and then they can read the story, and what we need is people to acknowledge what happened. And it's only then that I think we can start coming together There's a lot of trauma, and we still feel it, and it will teach people, to understand how it feels for us who are still going through a lot of pain, and that for our people who must be acknowledged for what they went through.
Forced removal varied by gender. Females were often taken first, and you could boil this down to the fact that men could still be used in the workforce. At the beginning of the scheme, females made up almost the entire population collected. The percentages of males and females evened out as more males were selected in the major 1911 collection. By 1917, many of these individuals being collected were not even recorded as being syphilitic. It would appear that this lock hospital scheme was a convenient excuse for racially based segregation and forced labour. So what hellhole were these poor souls unwillingly transported to? Most from Western Australia would end up on Bernier and Dorre Islands. Bernier and Dorre Islands lie in the Indian Ocean at the northwest extremity of Shark Bay, approximately 50 kilometres directly off the coast from the small town of Carnarvon. The islands were described as resource deficient and dry by early explorers and by Europeans visiting the hospitals at the time of the scheme. To modern eyes, these islands, typical of those of semi-arid environments, offer a number of different resources. Potential food includes small wallabies, reptiles, lizards, birds, edible plant varieties, and the numerous marine sources surrounding the island. The vegetation is low and scrubby on the whole, but suitable for fuel, and the sandalwood bushes offer natural medicines. Limestone, coral, and guano are also available for use as building materials. However, these were not necessarily the resources Europeans and Aboriginal people recognised, needed, or wanted at the time. Most of the Aboriginal people brought to the islands did not come from coastal communities. They were hundreds of miles from the homes whose resources and ways they understood, and were thrown uninvited into the territory of people unlikely to share the same languages or ideologies. Few Europeans at the time could read the country in the way that the traditional owners could. Now, you might think that life on a small coastal island might sound pretty idyllic, but in reality it's a harsh and grueling lifestyle, especially back at the turn of the 20th century. In March of 1909, shelter sheds were erected on each of the islands after 8 people died from what is described as coughs and colds. According to a later report by the Superintendent Medical Officer, Dr. Frederick Lovegrove, to the Chief Protector, the sheds, measuring 8 feet by 4 feet, had 3 canvas sides and a tin roof, and were expected to house 3 people each. However, the people used them in a variety of ways, some pushing the shelters together to make a camp for a larger group. The prisoner patients were given clothes, blankets, and rations of flour, sugar, tea, and tobacco. They also fished and hunted. And Dr. Lovegrove reported that, quote, a kangaroo dog, sent from Carnarvon by Dr. Hickenbotham, is of a great assistance in providing food and recreation, end quote. Newspapers, however, reported that the prisoner patients told visitors that they wanted to return to their own country. During the years of World War I, there was much less public attention to the lock hospitals, and public concerns were raised about the scheme's expense. There were periods when there wasn't even a single doctor on the island. In September of 1917, a Pilbara newspaper reported that the hospitals were likely to be closed, and this was endorsed by a cabinet meeting on the 6th of November 1917, with plans to transfer the remaining patients to Port Hedland. At the time of the announcement, it is reported there were still 35 females on Dorre Island and 15 males on Bernier. A Geraldton newspaper report about moves to close the hospital said, quote, "The natives themselves will be greatly pleased at this decision, as they looked upon deportation to the islands with even greater aversion than a Russian regards enforced absence in Siberia, and many and various were the stratagems resorted to by the collectors in mustering up these patients." End quote. The remaining patients left the islands on the 9th of January. They were taken to Carnarvon where they were held until being transferred. The Bernier and Dorre Island lock hospitals are part of a wider story of the medical incarceration of Aboriginal people across Australia. In Queensland, more than 1,144 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were admitted to a lock hospital that operated from 1928 to 1945 on Phantom Island in the Palm Island Group, 70 kilometres northeast of Townsville. These healthcare schemes led to the dislocation of multiple generations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from their families, communities and country, and were part of a pattern of events and policies that interrupted people's ability to care for their country and to undertake cultural practices and responsibilities. This history of incarceration has ongoing consequences for the families, communities and the country of those sent away. Recently, hundreds of people gathered in the remote Western Australian town of Carnarvon to mark the horrific chapter in the state's history, with the hope that it will lead to some kind of healing. Under the blazing West Aussie sun, the crowd watched as Carnarvon elder Bob Dorre, shirtless and painted, performed a traditional dance to release the trapped souls of 200 Aboriginal men, women and children who never made it back home from the Lock Hospital prisons.
It's been more than 100 years, but the memories haven't faded.
I couldn't believe it. It's because they were just sick people, you know. They needed help. They weren't criminals.
Under the Aboriginal Act of 1905, police diagnosed people suspected of contracting venereal diseases. They rounded them up and took them to the islands, to lock hospitals where the facilities were inadequate. Cut off from their families, they were forced to undergo experimental medical treatment. Over 200 people never returned, with over 100 dying on the islands. They were buried in unmarked graves. The crowd watched on as Elder Bob Dorre performed a dance to release their souls. Merle Dan's grandfather was a local tracker in the early 1900s. He told her mother of the difficulties he faced.
He said, I had no choice but to go and catch the Ganyara people who were stealing. He used to say, you know what, if he don't, I don't want to end up in the islands for not telling the truth.
And other elders can still remember the sights and sounds of the people being led away.
And as they were camping there, they could hear a mob of chains coming along, you know, up the river. The saddest thing, I think she said, the people were crying and, you know, they couldn't communicate.
It has taken time, but the state government and the Shire of Carnarvon have finally acknowledged the history.
Look, learn and listen, and then you'll understand. But we just helped the old people go through. And they did come and they whistled as they went past.
Marryuna.
I'm a proud black younger boy with a killer flow. Listen to the Iraqi, listen to it blow. Brother boys, younger boys, all the way from Anam land. Era boy, ini dan napu dah bitin era yung balan dabu gulgu. Tumur irangannya marciku. Napu kajati, napu tu ripu ko wala manguji. Marga mana pamir, ripu mejiku. Babu ina marcingannya go. Triggers mind blown, survival mode. Human brain, greatest weapon in the globe. Self-sustained education, knowledge is order, standing on everyone's shoulders. Teaching yourself as you get older and older.
Mala, our music is growing. I'm using my money. The river is flowing. Can you feel the wind blowing? Young one, Male, Marga. Mia, Kaderamo. So Marryuna, 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 Marryuna.
Tickety-tock on my block. First I'm on the train, I was shocked. Same time back home. Teaching little alleys to get on. Fear in my head, in my zone. Hunting bush life, but I can't feed them. This is Jungle, way of freedom. City lights, the sound. Too much in my mind, but the quiet, the nature sound. Now that is why I live and breathe and represent. Let it shine before the end of time. Lur, ira marching on your lur. Babu, you're not marching on your irma. Gaga, beg a boy, ga, marching now. Nigga, get the door. March it. Yeah. I'm a proud black little boy with a killer flow. Listen to the Iraqi, listen to it go.
You're more Mala, our music is growing. I'm using my money. The river is flowing. Can you feel the wind blowing? Young one, Ale, Marga. Mia, Kaderamo. So Marryuna, 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 Marryuna.
You guys hear that? You guys hear that? The pity. Let's go.
Marryuna.